All right, we got a good conversation coming up here. Kathy Jones, Chief Fixed Income Strategist, and Mike Townsend, Managing Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs, with me here this afternoon. Kathy, get us started here. Bonds day 2 rallying and yields dropping down to that old high from 2024, around 4.6. What do you make of that action?
Well, I think the market got really offsides before we got some of the good numbers. And so, the expectation was that we just continue to get inflationary type numbers. And when that didn't materialize, when we got a little bit of good news in the CPI, retail sales, I would not say was actually soft. When you look at the control group, it was up 0.7%. But overall, it wasn't above expectations. So I think the market's correcting after this, big surge to higher yields. Most of it probably positioning. And then we got the Waller comments today. Don't really know what to make of that because, as he said, there's a big if in there in terms of cutting rates this year. But it does show that there are people at the Fed who still want to cut rates in the first half of this year.
Waller's commentary today definitely meeting the bill for dovish. Do you think he's trying to push a message on the market, or maybe trying to push a message for a new job?
I really don't know what his attitude is towards a new job. But I do think that probably he was trying to be just intellectually clear. I mean, he did caveat that whole thing with it's if this, if that, if another thing, if we get inflation numbers that continue to show a declining trend, then you can't rule out the possibility of some rate cuts in the first half of the year. But again, he did a pretty good job of saying it depends on the data. So I don't know that there's anything new. It just showed that the Fed hasn't completely ruled out rate cuts in the first half.
Okay. Mike, in that conversation, we've heard that new admin's not going to mess with the timing for Powell's stay, but I do wonder if they are outward in their tone on liking lower rates. Will we start to hear more like dovish chatter from folks maybe interested in filling in the chair if Powell's going to be, when Powell's term is over?
Well, I think there's no question, Oliver, that there's a lot of people who would be interested in filling that chair. So there's certainly going to be buzz about that, and it'll build throughout the year. I think obviously probably no decision made until very late this year or even early next year. But it's certainly going to be interesting to watch. I mean, everybody's favorite parlor game is who's going to be next at any big job. So I think that's going to be the case with this one. But, as Kathy said, the Fed is like a lot of investors. We're all just waiting for detail on so many different things, tariffs, immigration policy, all these different things that are going to come out and affect the market. We just don't have any specifics, and that makes it hard to kind of look ahead. And I think the Fed is kind of covering itself a little bit with some of that uncertainty.
Mike, thinking about the priority of events, that one's farther out. So let's talk about the stuff that's sooner. Saw some reports overnight about what they might do with crypto and whether or not non-Bitcoin coins might be put on a strategic reserve. That's one, obviously, that we've been watching as like a major policy potential. What are you reading in the tea leaves on that?
Yeah, well, there's no question that crypto is going to be a big focus of not only the administration, but on Capitol Hill, too. Both the House and Senate have created subcommittees. The House had one, but now the Senate has one, too, on digital assets. And I think you're going to see a lot of bipartisan cooperation on trying to figure out the regulatory landscape for crypto in a frankly crypto-friendly way. I do think there's an open question as to sort of, which types of cryptocurrencies beyond Bitcoin will be included in that. I don't think any decisions have been made, but obviously a lot of investors are going to be watching that carefully to see how it plays out.
Kathy, on bonds for a sec, we got a little bit of flattening after like this runaway steepener for months last couple days. I think it kind of depends on how one reads the chart, if it's interesting or not, but should we read into it at all in your mind?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. It's a consequence of getting a little bit of good news and relief on the inflation front. But generally speaking, we continue to look for the curve to steepen this year. If, say, the Fed holds steady, that's going to be a reflection of the economy doing well and potentially a little bit more inflation pressure. That would push up long-term yields. And if you hold steady, short-term rates here, there is some room, obviously, to move up in long-term rates. If the Fed cuts, because the inflation numbers are good, yeah, I might see a little bit of flattening, but I think the overall long-term trend is still higher. You know, the one correlation with rising deficit spending that we can find is the yield curve. So yield curve tends to steepen when we get a lot more in the way of deficit spending. It tends to flatten otherwise. So my guess is that if we get some of the tax cuts and the spending that is anticipated, we'd probably see a steeper curve from here.
Okay. One last point on policy makers. Does it look like the economic picks are going to be smooth sailing, Mike? Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick, what are you watching in terms of any volatility for leadership?
Yeah, Scott Bessent had his hearing today, and I think there were no big red flags there. Howard Lutnick, the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, is in for Commerce, which is a really important job and increasingly important, I think, given the relationship between the Commerce Department and China on things like semiconductors and artificial intelligence. And then you add in there the SEC pick, Paul Atkins, a known quantity. I think it's pretty notable. Trump has picked relatively non-controversial people on the economic team. His more controversial picks are in some other areas of the government. And I think that speaks a lot to how important he thinks the economy and the stock market performing well is. That's so important to him. And I think these picks reflect that, and they should be confirmed.
Okay. Thanks. Appreciate the thoughts, guys. Good stuff.